Listen to me right now, because this might be the wake-up call you didn't know you needed. The world is moving faster than ever. Expectations are rising. And the truth most people avoid is this. If you don't grow, you don't just stay where you are. You get left behind. Nobody announces it. Nobody warns you. But silently, consistently, someone out there is preparing, improving, showing up stronger. And they are ready to take the place you're not fighting to keep. I want you to feel this in your spirit today. You were not created to be average, replaceable, or forgotten. God did not design you to shrink back when life demands more. But potential alone is not enough. Faith without action is empty. If you keep delaying your growth, avoiding discipline, and ignoring your calling, the opportunities meant for you will pass into the hands of someone who chose to step up when you didn't. And here's the hard truth. You don't get replaced because you're not talented. You get replaced because you stopped stretching, you stopped learning, you stopped showing up with excellence. Every single day, your habits are voting for your future. Are you choosing comfort or are you choosing calling? Because your calling requires courage, it requires consistency, it requires you to do the things most people are too distracted or too afraid to do. So today I challenge you, no more excuses, no more waiting for the right moment. This is your moment. Decide to grow, decide to pray deeper, work harder, focus longer, and believe stronger. Because when you align your effort with your faith, you become unstoppable. And nobody can replace a person who is fully committed to becoming who God called them to be. If this message is speaking to your heart, take a second right now. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for daily motivation that keeps you focused and fired up. And I want you to engage, write a powerful quote in the comments that pushes you forward. And also comment one thing you're believing God for today. Remember the words often echoed by Brendon Burchard. Consistency is the ultimate competitive advantage. Now go live like that truth matters. Right now, I want you to understand something. Most people never truly accept until life forces them to. You are always being evaluated, even when no one is watching, even when no one is speaking about you, even when it feels like your life is on pause. There is a silent measurement happening around you all the time, not by people only, but by the results of your own choices, your habits, your consistency, your discipline, and your emotional control. In moments when nothing external is pushing you, every day you wake up, you are building a reputation with life itself. Not just with your boss, not just with your friends, not just with your family, but with opportunity, with responsibility, and with the future version of yourself that is watching everything you do right now. The truth is, life does not wait for you to feel ready. Life does not pause because you are distracted. Life continues to assign value based on what you repeatedly demonstrate, not what you occasionally promise. And most people miss this entirely because they think evaluation only happens in obvious moments. They believe they are being judged only during interviews, exams, meetings, or public performances. But the deeper reality is that the most important evaluation is happening in private moments, when no applause is available, when no pressure is forcing performance, when no external accountability exists. What you do in those moments is what defines your trajectory far more than anything you do in public. Think about the quiet decisions you make when you are alone, the moment you decide to delay something important, the moment you choose distraction over discipline, the moment you tell yourself, I'll do it later, and no one calls you out on it. Those moments are not invisible in terms of impact. They are quietly shaping your identity, your standards, and your capacity to handle greater responsibility. There is a version of you being formed in silence, and that version is either becoming stronger or weaker every single day. There is no neutral ground. You are either reinforcing excellence or reinforcing avoidance. You are either training yourself to rise under pressure or training yourself to escape pressure. And what you repeatedly train becomes your automatic response when life gets serious. Most people want big opportunities, but they underestimate how much those opportunities observe consistency before arrival. Opportunity does not just appear and decide randomly. It aligns itself with readiness, and readiness is built in private repetition. The way you think when no one is around, the way you act when no one is checking, the way you handle boredom, discomfort, and repetition. These are the signals that define whether you are expanding or shrinking. You must understand that your life is constantly broadcasting signals. Every habit is a signal. Every delay is a signal. Every act of discipline is a signal. And these signals accumulate into a pattern that determines what kind of challenges and opportunities you are trusted with. If your signals show inconsistency, life responds with smaller responsibility. If your signals show reliability, life expands your access. This is why two people with the same talent can end up in completely different realities. One decides to show up consistently, even when motivation fades, while the other only performs when inspiration is high. Over time, their identities diverge. One becomes trusted with more, the other becomes replaceable, not because of lack of ability, but because of lack of repetition. There is a quiet truth that high performers live by. Your private standards are your public destiny. What you accept in silence becomes what you express in life. If you accept low effort in private, you will eventually express low results in public. If you accept distraction in private, you will express lack of focus in public. If you accept inconsistency in private, you will express instability in public performance. And here is where it becomes deeply important. You are not only being evaluated by others, you are being evaluated by your future self. The person you are becoming is watching you right now. That future version of you is shaped by whether you take action or avoid it, whether you grow or stagnate, whether you choose discipline or comfort. That future version is not separate from you. It is being constructed by you, moment by moment. Most people underestimate how quickly evaluation compounds. They think one missed day, one skipped effort, one delayed action does not matter. But identity is not built in single moments. It is built in accumulated evidence. One decision does not define you, but repeated decisions form a pattern, and patterns become identity. Once identity is formed, behavior becomes automatic. So when you repeatedly choose ease, you are not just making a temporary choice, you are reinforcing a version of yourself that defaults to ease. When you repeatedly choose focus, you are reinforcing a version of yourself that defaults to discipline. And over time, these defaults determine how you respond to pressure, opportunity, and responsibility without needing to consciously think. This is why life can feel like it suddenly changed, when in reality it was just responding to a long pattern that finally became visible. People often think transformation happens overnight, but what actually happens is accumulation reaching a visible threshold. The evaluation was always happening, but the results only become obvious when the pattern becomes undeniable. And you have to be honest with yourself here. Where are you currently being evaluated in silence? In your habits, in your focus, in your follow-through, in your emotional regulation when things are not easy. These are the areas that determine whether you are building strength or slowly eroding it. Because the truth is, life does not only reward intelligence or talent. Life rewards reliability. Life rewards consistency. Life rewards the person who can be counted on even when circumstances are not ideal. And reliability is always proven in private before it is rewarded in public. You may not see immediate consequences for your choices, but that does not mean evaluation is not happening. It simply means the results are still forming. And what is forming right now is based entirely on what you repeatedly choose when no one is correcting you, no one is reminding you, no one is pushing you. This is where personal responsibility becomes the most powerful force in your life. When you realize that no moment is neutral, that every action is either building or weakening your future, you begin to approach life differently. You begin to treat small decisions with seriousness. You begin to understand that excellence is not an event. It is a standard that must be maintained even in silence. There is a shift that happens when you stop waiting for external evaluation and start respecting internal evaluation. When you stop asking, will anyone notice, and start asking, what am I becoming through this? Your entire behavior starts to elevate. You begin to move differently, think differently, and act with more intention, because the most dangerous place to be is not failure, it is unnoticed decline. When no one is watching and you slowly start lowering your standards, it feels harmless in the moment. But over time, it creates a gap between who you could have been and who you are becoming. And that gap is always revealed eventually through life's outcomes. You are always in process, always being shaped, always being measured by consistency more than intention. And the more you understand this, the more deliberate your life becomes. You start choosing actions not based on emotion, but based on identity alignment. You start asking whether what you are doing is reinforcing the person you want to become or weakening it. There is a quiet intensity in this awareness. Not pressure, but clarity. Not fear, but responsibility. A deep recognition that every moment matters because every moment is contributing to a direction. And direction is everything, because where you end up is not determined by one big decision, but by thousands of small evaluations stacked over time. Comfort is one of the most dangerous states a human being can live in, not because comfort itself is evil, but because it quietly removes the edge that keeps you growing. It does not announce itself as a threat. It does not feel like failure. In fact, it often feels like safety, stability, and peace. But over time, comfort begins to reshape your identity in ways you do not notice until your potential feels far away and your life starts feeling smaller than what you once imagined it could be. When you choose comfort repeatedly, you are not just choosing ease in a moment. You are training your mind and body to avoid resistance. And resistance is the exact environment where growth lives. Everything meaningful in life requires resistance at some stage. Strength requires resistance. Skill requires resistance. Discipline requires resistance. Even emotional maturity requires you to sit in discomfort long enough to understand yourself more deeply instead of escaping what you feel. The problem is that comfort slowly convinces you that resistance is unnecessary. It teaches you to interpret discomfort as danger, when in reality discomfort is often just growth in progress. The gym feels uncomfortable because muscles are being broken and rebuilt. Learning something new feels uncomfortable because your identity is being stretched beyond its current limits. Facing difficult conversations feels uncomfortable because truth requires emotional courage. But comfort will always whisper that avoiding these things is the safer option. And when you listen to that whisper repeatedly, something subtle begins to happen. Your tolerance for challenge decreases. Your patience for effort weakens. Your ability to stay consistent under pressure starts to fade. You may still look the same from the outside, but internally your capacity is shrinking, and that shrinking does not feel dramatic. It feels like procrastination becoming normal. It feels like delay becoming routine. It feels like saying, I'll do it later, becoming your default response to anything that requires effort. Comfort does not destroy you in one moment. It slowly replaces your edge with softness. And softness, when unbalanced by discipline, leads to stagnation. You stop pushing yourself. You stop testing your limits. You stop entering spaces where you might fail, even though failure is exactly where growth is hiding. And without realizing it, your world becomes smaller, not because the world shrank, but because your willingness to engage with difficulty did. There is a reason why high performers in any field are never fully comfortable for long. They intentionally place themselves in situations where they have to stretch. They understand that comfort is not a destination. It is a temporary state between levels of growth. The moment you settle into comfort for too long, you begin to lose the qualities that brought you success in the first place. Hunger fades, urgency fades, focus becomes diluted, and what once felt like ambition slowly becomes maintenance. Most people misunderstand this process because comfort does not feel like decline at first. It feels like reward. You work hard, you achieve something, and naturally you want to relax. But the danger begins when relaxation turns into identity. When resting becomes your default rather than your recovery phase. When ease becomes your expectation rather than your break. That is when growth begins to slow down without you noticing. There is a deeper truth here that is often ignored. Your current level of comfort is directly connected to your past level of discipline. What you are enjoying today was once built by effort you were willing to endure. But if you stop paying that price, you do not stay at the same level. You slowly begin to lose it. Because everything in life requires maintenance, and maintenance in personal growth is continued discomfort, continued effort, continued stretching beyond what feels easy. The mind naturally resists discomfort because it is wired to conserve energy. It prefers predictability. It prefers routines that require less mental and emotional effort. But growth does not live in predictability. Growth lives in unfamiliar territory. And every time you choose familiarity over growth, you are reinforcing a version of yourself that prioritizes safety over expansion. And that version of you may feel peaceful in the moment, but over time it becomes restrictive. You begin to notice that opportunities that once excited you now feel intimidating. Challenges that once motivated you now feel overwhelming. And instead of stepping forward, you step back. Not because you are incapable, but because your tolerance for discomfort has decreased. This is how comfort quietly changes your identity. It does not remove your potential. It reduces your willingness to access it. Your abilities remain, but your activation of them becomes inconsistent. You still know what to do, but you delay doing it. You still understand your goals, but you avoid the effort required to reach them consistently. And this is where many people get stuck. They do not realize that the gap between their current life and their desired life is not intelligence or opportunity. It is tolerance for discomfort, the ability to stay present in effort when it is not exciting, the ability to continue when motivation disappears, the ability to remain consistent when progress is slow. Comfort tells you to wait for the right feeling. Growth demands that you act regardless of feeling. Comfort tells you to avoid pressure. Growth requires that you learn how to function under pressure. Comfort tells you to choose what feels good now. Growth requires you to choose what builds you later. There is a subtle negotiation that happens every day in your mind. One side is comfort, offering immediate relief. The other side is growth, offering delayed transformation. And every decision you make is a vote, not just for what you do, but for who you are becoming. When you consistently vote for comfort, you are reinforcing a life that avoids challenge. When you consistently vote for growth, you are reinforcing a life that expands capacity. What makes comfort so powerful is that it disguises itself as self-care. It convinces you that avoiding difficulty is healthy, when in reality excessive avoidance leads to weakness. True self-care includes discipline. It includes doing what is necessary for your future self, even when your present self resists it. Because your future self depends on the strength you build now, not the comfort you choose now. There is also an emotional side to comfort that people rarely talk about. Comfort protects you from uncertainty, but it also protects you from growth. Because growth requires uncertainty. You cannot grow into something you already fully understand. You have to step into unknown territory. You have to risk failure. You have to accept the possibility of not being immediately good at something. And comfort resists all of that because it prefers control and familiarity. But control is often an illusion when it comes to personal development. The only real control you have is your response to discomfort. You cannot control how difficult something feels at first. You cannot control how long mastery takes. You cannot control how many setbacks you will face. But you can control whether you stay or retreat, whether you persist or withdraw, whether you allow discomfort to shape you or stop you. Every time you step into discomfort, you are expanding your identity. You are teaching yourself that you can survive resistance, that you can handle uncertainty, that you can continue even when things are not easy, and that expansion becomes part of who you are. Over time, what once felt difficult becomes manageable. What once felt overwhelming becomes normal. That is how growth actually happens. Not through sudden transformation, but through repeated exposure to discomfort. Comfort will always try to bring you back to what is familiar. It will suggest that you have done enough. It will whisper that rest is more important than progress. And sometimes rest is necessary, but when rest becomes avoidance, it becomes limitation. The key is awareness. Knowing when you are truly recovering versus when you are simply avoiding. There is a quiet discipline in choosing discomfort on purpose. Not because you enjoy pain, but because you understand its role in development. Just like physical strength is built by resisting weight, mental and emotional strength are built by resisting avoidance. The resistance is what creates adaptation. Without resistance, nothing changes. So when you feel the pull toward comfort, when you feel the urge to delay, when you feel the temptation to choose what is easy over what is necessary, understand what is happening. It is not just a choice between two actions. It is a choice between two directions of identity. One leads to expansion, the other leads to contraction. One builds capacity, the other reduces it. And the most important part of this awareness is realizing that comfort does not need to be eliminated from your life. It needs to be managed. It has a place, but it cannot lead. It cannot define your decisions. It cannot become your default response to challenge. Because the moment comfort becomes your guide, growth quietly steps aside, and what remains is a life that feels safe, but slowly becomes unfulfilling in its depth. And potential skill growth is not something that happens by accident, and it is not something that arrives through occasional effort. It is a continuous responsibility that you carry every single day, whether you acknowledge it or not. The moment you decide to stop improving, you do not remain the same. You begin to decline. Because in a world that is constantly evolving, standing still is the same as moving backward. Every skill you have today was once something you did not know how to do. It was uncomfortable at first, unfamiliar, even frustrating. But through repetition, patience, and willingness to stay in the learning process, it became part of your ability. That is the natural law of growth. Nothing becomes mastery without exposure, and nothing becomes strength without consistent development. The mistake most people make is believing that once they reach a certain level of competence, they are done learning. They treat skill as a destination instead of a living system. But skill is not a fixed possession. It is something that either expands or weakens depending on how often you invest in it. If you are not actively growing, you are slowly losing sharpness. Not suddenly, not visibly at first, but gradually through reduced effort, less curiosity, and fewer intentional challenges. Skill growth demands humility, because every time you step into improvement, you are admitting that there is more you do not know than what you already know. And many people resist that feeling. They want to be seen as capable without being challenged. They want results without repetition. They want recognition without refinement. But skill does not respond to desire. It responds to discipline. There is a quiet truth in all fields of excellence. The people who rise are not always the most talented, but they are always the most consistent in improving their ability. They treat skill as something sacred, something that requires daily attention. They do not wait for motivation to practice. They do not wait for inspiration to learn. They understand that growth is built in moments of repetition that often feel unremarkable in the present but become powerful in the long run. Skill growth also requires honesty with yourself, because it is easy to believe you are improving simply because you are staying active. But activity is not the same as progress. You can be busy without becoming better. You can repeat actions without refining them. You can stay engaged without increasing your effectiveness. True growth requires reflection. It requires asking whether your actions are producing higher quality outcomes or just maintaining familiar patterns. Most people underestimate how subtle skill development actually is. It is not always dramatic improvement. Often it is small refinements. Better timing, clearer thinking, faster execution, stronger focus, fewer mistakes, improved awareness. These small improvements compound over time, and eventually they create a noticeable difference in performance. But if you are not paying attention, you may miss the fact that these improvements are not automatic. They require deliberate effort. There is a difference between doing something repeatedly and doing it progressively. Repetition alone creates familiarity. Progressive repetition creates mastery. And the difference lies in intention. When you approach a skill with intention, you are constantly adjusting, correcting, and refining. You are not just going through motions. You are analyzing your performance and asking how it can be improved. That mindset is what transforms average ability into exceptional capability. Skill growth also demands discomfort, because improvement always reveals your limitations. Every time you push your ability further, you encounter areas where you are not yet strong. That moment can either become a stopping point or a stepping stone. Many people stop there because they interpret limitation as failure. But in reality, limitation is just information. It shows you exactly where growth is needed. If you avoid that discomfort, you remain within your current skill level. But if you engage with it, you expand your capacity. That is why every expert was once a beginner who refused to stop at discomfort. They stayed in the process long enough for discomfort to turn into competence. And competence eventually becomes confidence, not because they avoided difficulty, but because they worked through it repeatedly. Another important part of skill growth is feedback. Without feedback, improvement becomes slow and uncertain. Feedback is what reveals blind spots. It shows you what you cannot see on your own. But many people resist feedback because it challenges their self-image. They want to feel competent, not corrected. Yet correction is the pathway to refinement. When you ignore feedback, you protect your ego but limit your growth. When you accept feedback, you may temporarily feel uncomfortable, but you gain clarity that allows you to improve faster. And in the long run, clarity is far more valuable than comfort. Because clarity shows you exactly what needs to change, while comfort keeps you in familiar patterns. Skill growth also requires patience with repetition. Many people underestimate how long mastery actually takes. They expect rapid transformation, but real skill development is slow and layered. It requires returning to the same fundamentals again and again, each time with slightly better understanding. This repetition is not wasted effort. It is how depth is created. Think of any skill at a high level. Whether it is communication, leadership, discipline, creativity, or technical ability, what looks effortless from the outside is the result of thousands of repeated actions behind the scenes. Those actions were not always perfect. They were refined through constant correction. And that refinement only happens through willingness to stay in the process longer than most people are willing to stay. There is also a mental shift required for skill growth. You have to stop identifying with where you currently are and start identifying with where you are going. If you attach your identity too strongly to your current level of ability, you will resist situations that challenge it. But if you see yourself as someone in development, then challenges become opportunities instead of threats. That shift changes everything. Because now mistakes are not personal failures. They are part of the process. You begin to see errors as data, not damage. You begin to see difficulty as training, not punishment. And that perspective keeps you engaged in growth even when progress feels slow. Skill growth is also deeply connected to attention. What you consistently pay attention to determines how fast you improve. If you are distracted while practicing a skill, your improvement slows down significantly. But if you are fully present, noticing details, adjusting in real time, and correcting mistakes immediately, your learning accelerates. Presence is one of the most underrated tools in development. Another key element is consistency over intensity. Many people try to improve through bursts of effort, but skill growth does not respond well to inconsistency. It responds to regular engagement. Even small daily improvement is more powerful than occasional intense effort, because consistency builds memory in your system. It trains your brain, your body, and your behavior to operate at a higher standard automatically over time. Skill growth also requires letting go of comparison. When you constantly compare your current level to someone else's mastery, you create frustration instead of focus. Comparison can inspire awareness, but it can also create discouragement if misused. The most effective approach is to compare yourself only to your previous self. That way, your focus remains on progress, not pressure. There is a quiet discipline in choosing to improve even when no one is watching, even when no one is rewarding you, even when results are not immediate. That discipline builds depth, and depth is what sustains long-term success. Without depth, performance becomes fragile. With depth, performance becomes stable under pressure. Skill growth is not just about external ability. It also strengthens internal qualities like patience, resilience, focus, and emotional control. As you improve your skills, you are also shaping your character. Because the process of improvement requires you to deal with frustration, repetition, uncertainty, and delayed results. And how you handle those experiences shapes who you become internally. The more you commit to skill growth, the more you realize it is not separate from life. It is life. Every interaction, every task, every challenge becomes an opportunity to refine your ability. And over time, improvement stops feeling like an activity and becomes a way of living. There is a point where skill growth becomes identity-driven rather than outcome-driven. You no longer improve just for results, but because improvement is who you are. That shift creates consistency that does not depend on motivation. It becomes automatic. And in that state, growth is no longer something you try to do. It is something you naturally continue, because not growing feels unnatural. Faith without action is one of the most misunderstood states in human experience. Many people believe faith is only about belief, about trusting something greater, about holding hope in the unseen. But real faith is never passive. Real faith is always active. It is belief expressed through movement, through decisions, through discipline, through consistent steps taken even when certainty is not available. Without action, faith becomes an idea. With action, faith becomes a force that shapes reality. There is a subtle danger in separating faith from behavior. When people believe they can hold faith internally without expressing it externally, they begin to disconnect belief from responsibility. They start to think that simply hoping, wishing, or praying is enough without aligning their daily actions with what they claim to believe. But alignment is where transformation happens. Faith that is not aligned with action remains invisible in outcomes. Every meaningful change in life requires movement toward what you believe. You cannot claim to believe in growth while avoiding the behaviors that produce growth. You cannot claim to believe in opportunity while refusing to prepare for it. You cannot claim to believe in progress while staying in patterns that produce stagnation. At some point, belief must translate into behavior, or it remains incomplete. Action is what gives faith structure. Without action, faith has no direction. It becomes scattered emotion rather than focused energy. But when you act on what you believe, you give your faith a pathway to express itself in the physical world. That is when things begin to shift. Not because belief alone changed reality, but because belief guided consistent behavior that eventually changed outcomes. There is a reason why every breakthrough story includes action before transformation. People do not change their lives by thinking differently alone. They change their lives by behaving differently long enough for new results to emerge. And those behaviors are often uncomfortable at first. They require stepping into uncertainty, taking risks, and moving before there is visible proof that the outcome will work. That is where faith becomes real. Not in certainty, but in movement, despite uncertainty. When you act without having full clarity, you are demonstrating trust not just in an outcome, but in a process. You are saying that even if I cannot see everything clearly, I will still move forward based on what I believe to be true. That is what separates passive belief from active faith. Many people struggle here because action requires vulnerability. It exposes you to failure, rejection, and uncertainty. It removes the illusion of safety that comes from staying still. When you do not act, you remain in a space where nothing is tested, and therefore nothing can be lost. But nothing can also be gained. And that hidden cost of inaction is often greater than the risk of action itself. Faith requires you to accept that uncertainty is part of growth. You do not need full clarity to begin. You need enough conviction to take the next step. And that step, repeated consistently, becomes a path. But if you wait for complete certainty before acting, you will remain in preparation indefinitely. Because certainty often comes after movement, not before it. There is a pattern seen in every area of life. Clarity increases with action. The more you move, the more you understand. The more you engage, the more direction becomes visible. Waiting for clarity before action reverses this process and leads to stagnation. Faith recognizes that movement itself is part of the discovery process. When you align faith with action, you begin to experience momentum. Momentum is not created by thinking. It is created by doing. Even small actions, when repeated, create psychological and emotional energy that builds confidence. And confidence is what allows faith to deepen. Because once you see that your actions produce results, your belief becomes reinforced by experience. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. A single intense moment of action does not create lasting change. But repeated, steady action aligned with belief begins to reshape identity and outcomes. It is not about doing everything at once. It is about doing the next right thing repeatedly until momentum takes over. There is also a deeper internal shift that happens when faith is backed by action. You begin to trust yourself more. Because self-trust is not built through intention alone. It is built through follow-through. Every time you act on what you said you would do, you strengthen your internal credibility. And every time you fail to act, you weaken it. Over time, this internal credibility becomes the foundation of confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from external validation, but the kind that comes from knowing you will act in alignment with your beliefs, regardless of circumstances. That is a powerful state because it makes you stable under pressure. Faith without action often leads to frustration. People feel like they are believing, hoping, and praying, but nothing changes. And the frustration is not because faith is ineffective, but because faith is incomplete without expression. It is like having direction without movement. You may know where you want to go, but without walking, you remain in the same place. Action transforms faith from internal emotion into external evidence. And evidence is what reinforces belief over time. When you see results from your actions, your faith deepens naturally. It becomes less abstract and more grounded in lived experience. That grounding is what allows belief to withstand challenges. There is also a discipline required to act consistently when results are not immediate. Because many people start with enthusiasm, but stop when progress feels slow. They interpret slow progress as failure, when in reality it is the natural rhythm of development. Faith requires patience with the invisible phase of growth, where action is producing change that is not yet visible. In that phase, discipline becomes essential. You continue acting not because you see immediate proof, but because you trust the process. And that trust is what keeps you moving when motivation fades. Motivation is temporary, but faith-driven discipline is stable. Another important aspect is emotional alignment. When your actions contradict your beliefs, internal conflict arises. You may believe in growth, but if your behavior avoids growth, you feel tension. That tension is your system signaling misalignment. But when action and belief align, there is a sense of internal clarity and peace. That alignment does not always feel easy, but it feels right. Even when it is difficult, there is a sense that you are moving in the correct direction. That feeling is not emotional excitement. It is internal coherence. And coherence is what sustains long-term progress. Faith also requires courage because action often demands that you step into uncertainty before outcomes are guaranteed. You may not know if your effort will succeed, but you act anyway because belief is stronger than fear. That is what makes faith powerful. It does not eliminate fear. It moves through it. When faith is expressed through action, it begins to shape identity. You start becoming someone who follows through. Someone who does not just think about possibilities but acts on them. Someone who does not just hope for change but participates in creating it. That identity shift is what produces lasting transformation. Over time, action-based faith changes how you see yourself. You no longer define yourself by what you intend to do, but by what you consistently do, and that consistency becomes evidence of who you are becoming. There is a quiet strength in this way of living. It removes dependence on emotional highs and replaces it with steady movement. It removes reliance on external confirmation and replaces it with internal commitment. It turns belief into behavior and behavior into results. And in that process, faith becomes not just something you hold, but something you live through action that continues even when uncertainty remains present. Discipline is often misunderstood as restriction, punishment, or pressure, but in its highest form, discipline is actually freedom in structure. It is the ability to choose a standard and remain aligned with it even when emotions shift, even when motivation disappears, even when circumstances become uncomfortable. Discipline is what separates intention from reality. It is the bridge between who you are and who you are capable of becoming. Most people think success comes from talent or opportunity, but those are only starting points. What determines whether someone remains stable in success or collapses under pressure is discipline, because discipline is what keeps you consistent when external energy is not supporting you. It is what keeps you moving when inspiration fades. It is what keeps you committed when results are delayed. Without discipline, potential remains unused. With discipline, even average ability becomes powerful over time, because discipline multiplies whatever you consistently do. If you are consistent in effort, discipline amplifies your results. If you are inconsistent, discipline reveals the gap between your intention and your action. There is a quiet truth that most people avoid. Your life is not shaped by what you know, but by what you consistently do. Knowledge without discipline becomes unused awareness. Awareness without discipline becomes frustration. But when knowledge is paired with discipline, it becomes transformation. Discipline is not something you feel. It is something you decide. Emotions are unstable. Motivation rises and falls. Circumstances change constantly, but discipline remains steady because it is not dependent on conditions. It is dependent on commitment. And commitment is a decision you revisit every time resistance appears. Every time you choose discipline over comfort, you are reinforcing identity. You are teaching yourself that your decisions are not controlled by temporary feelings. You are building internal authority. And that internal authority becomes the foundation for every area of success, whether personal, emotional, professional, or spiritual. But discipline is not built in big dramatic moments. It is built in small, almost invisible decisions. Waking up when you said you would, doing the task even when you do not feel like it, continuing when no one is watching, choosing focus over distraction. These small moments are where discipline is either strengthened or weakened. And because these moments seem small, people underestimate their importance. They think missing one day, skipping one task, or delaying one responsibility does not matter. But discipline is not measured in isolated events. It is measured in patterns. And patterns are formed through repetition. When discipline is repeated, it becomes identity. When it is ignored repeatedly, avoidance becomes identity. That is why discipline is not just about actions. It is about who you are becoming through those actions. Every disciplined choice reinforces a stronger version of yourself. Every undisciplined choice reinforces a weaker version. There is also a misunderstanding that discipline is rigid or harsh. In reality, discipline creates emotional stability. When your life is governed by discipline, you experience less internal chaos. You are not constantly negotiating with yourself. You are not constantly debating whether to act or not act. You already know your standard and you follow it. That reduces mental fatigue. Without discipline, every decision becomes a negotiation. Should I do it now or later? Should I continue or stop? Should I push forward or give up? This constant internal debate drains energy. Discipline removes that debate by replacing it with structure. And structure is not limiting, it is supportive. It frees your mind from unnecessary decision-making so you can focus your energy on execution instead of hesitation. That is why highly disciplined people often appear calm. Their energy is not wasted on internal conflict. It is directed toward action. Discipline also builds trust within yourself. Self-trust is not created through positive thinking. It is created through follow-through. Every time you do what you said you would do, you strengthen trust in your own reliability. And every time you break your own commitment, you weaken it. Over time, this internal trust becomes crucial. Because when you trust yourself, you act with clarity. When you don't trust yourself, you hesitate. And hesitation slows down progress in every area of life. Discipline is also deeply connected to emotional control. Not because you suppress emotions, but because you do not allow emotions to dictate behavior. You can feel tired and still act. You can feel uncertain and still move forward. You can feel resistance and still remain consistent. Discipline is the ability to act beyond emotional fluctuation. This does not mean ignoring how you feel. It means recognizing that feelings are temporary signals, not permanent instructions. If you act only based on feelings, your life becomes unpredictable. If you act based on discipline, your life becomes stable and directional. There is a moment in every person's growth where they realize that waiting for motivation is a trap. Motivation is unreliable. It appears after action, not before it. Discipline is what starts action without needing motivation. And once action begins, motivation often follows. This is why discipline is often uncomfortable at first. It requires you to move without emotional readiness. It requires you to begin before you feel prepared. But that is exactly what builds strength, because strength is not built in comfort, it is built in resistance. Every disciplined action creates evidence. Evidence that you can rely on yourself. Evidence that you can act even when it is difficult. Evidence that you are capable of consistency. And that evidence accumulates over time into confidence. Confidence is not something you wait for. It is something you build through repeated disciplined action. And once confidence is built through discipline, it becomes stable. It does not disappear when circumstances change. There is also a deeper identity shift that happens through discipline. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to be consistent and start seeing yourself as someone who is consistent. That shift changes everything, because identity drives behavior more than intention ever will. When discipline becomes identity, effort becomes natural. You no longer argue with yourself as much. You no longer need external pressure to act. You simply follow the standard you have built. That is when growth becomes sustainable. Discipline also protects you from regret, because most regret does not come from failure. It comes from inconsistency, from knowing you could have done more but choosing not to, from recognizing potential but not acting on it. Discipline reduces that gap between potential and action. There is a quiet power in knowing that you are doing what you said you would do, even when progress is slow, even when results are not immediate, even when no one is watching. That quiet power builds dignity within yourself. Discipline also changes how you experience time. Without discipline, time feels scattered. Days blur together without progress. With discipline, time becomes structured. You begin to see clear progress markers. You begin to feel movement. And movement creates meaning. When you feel progress, even small progress, your life feels more directed. Without discipline, time passes without direction, and that creates frustration, even if external circumstances seem fine. Discipline is also a form of self-respect, because when you respect yourself, you do not consistently break your own commitments. You do not repeatedly choose short-term comfort over long-term growth. You begin to treat your goals and responsibilities as something worth honoring. And that self-respect strengthens every area of life. It improves relationships because you become more reliable. It improves work because you become more consistent. It improves internal stability because you are no longer in constant conflict with yourself. Ultimately, discipline is not about forcing yourself into rigidity. It is about building a life where your actions match your intentions so consistently that internal conflict dissolves. It is about becoming someone who can be trusted by others and by yourself. And the more discipline becomes part of your identity, the less life feels like something happening to you, and the more it feels like something you are actively shaping through steady, intentional, repeated action that aligns with your highest standard